The Rakata, an ancient empire hellbent on cannibalizing every civilization in their path. They were the first users of the dark side to truly make themselves an issue for everyone else in the galaxy. And in the days prior to the Republic, they were the rulers of the galaxy itself. That was before a strange virus spread amongst their race, cutting them off from the Force and driving them towards complete extinction. But what if history took a different course? What if the Rakata had regained their connection to the dark side, rebuilt their army, and returned to conquer the galaxy once again during the Clone Wars? If that were to happen, could the Republic survive? Greetings again, lore junkies, and welcome to the archives. In today's Holocron video, we are going to explore a scenario where the Infinite Empire at their peak makes a play for revenge, and hopefully we'll answer the question of if the Clone Wars era Republic could survive a Rakatan onslaught. Let's begin. We want to make something apparent up front. Our aim is to not necessarily concoct a big story here, but rather to basically pluck the Infinite Empire as it existed at its apex at around 30,000 BBY, hurling them at the Republic in 20 BBY. This means that we will be using their technology, armament, and military of that era. In a true what-if fanfiction, obviously a returned Infinite Empire will have vastly advanced its technology since its previous incarnation. But since we don't have the ability to measure exactly how far they would advance, we didn't want to make any speculations. Besides, we want to measure their purest form against the Clone Wars Republic. So for that reason, we're not making the assumptions that they would improve their ship size or employ any modern weaponry. We are, however, going to give them super weapons such as the Starforge. So with that aside, let's begin with comparing their military power. The strength of the Infinite Empire lay in their fleet, which were powered by harvesting Force-sensitive slaves and turning them into living batteries. From ships to weapons, all of the Rakata's technology was powered by the Force. This was what allowed their advancements to leap centuries into the future ahead of most species of their era. Being the most powerful and advanced race meant that they could prey on the still primitive worlds of the galaxy, but they would certainly not have this advantage in the era of the Clone Wars. We are unfortunately never given specs on the average Rakatan warship, however, but we did our best to figure out their size, strength, and offensive capability based on the comics in which they appear. By our own estimations, a Rakatan warship is maybe only a third of the size of a Venator class Star Destroyer. They appear to have two powerful energy cannons on the front end of the ship. In terms of defense, they would have had very thick armor and minimal shielding. Back in the more ancient era, deflector technology was not yet typically used for military purposes. It was developed originally to protect ships from atmospheric heat during landing and takeoff sequences. In their day, the Rakata had the strongest navy largely because they had the only navy. They were the first species to develop long-range hyperdrive technology, so the worlds they visited had never had to defend themselves from extraterrestrial invaders or threats before. The Rakata wrecked any civilization in their way because blaster technology was still very primitive, if it even existed at all. The Rakatan Starfighters were essentially miniature versions of their warships, only without a dorsal fin. Unfortunately for the Infinite Empire, their navy is drastically overmatched. The Venator-class Star Destroyers alone would utterly pulverize the Rakatan warships. Force-based technology or not, it's more than likely that a Republic flotilla could match or destroy a Rakatan attack force. Venators were 1,137 meters in length, contained extremely powerful deflector shields, and, on average, were armed with 8 heavy turbo blaster batteries, as well as up to 64-point defense laser cannons, tractor beam projectors, 4 proton torpedo tubes, and more. But let's get smaller. Combating the Rakatan Starfighters are the clones piloting the ARC-170s, Y-Wing bombers, A-Wing intercenters, LAAT gunships, and of course the Jedi in their signature ETA-2 Actis-class interceptors. The Rakata are so vastly outgunned that it's horrific to even compare them. But let's assume that the Rakata pilots have an edge with being Force wielders. Even if they're only contending with Jedi pilots, for the Republic, we think it would still feel like fly swatting. The Rakatan last faced the G-Day using their Hunter-class fighters. The Hunter-class fighters were ships that were extremely fast and maneuverable with heavy armaments, but we do not have any indication that they were shielded. But we must point out that the Rakata struggled to fight them, even though the Hunter-class fighters were only the fastest in the Tythos system, not even the fastest in the galaxy at the time. And this is in the ancient era, when engines were not as advanced. The Actis-class interceptors had vastly improved laser cannons, missile launchers, and were powered by twin-ion engines. Those engines were the fastest in the galaxy, even deep into the Imperial era. The Jedi pilots would be flying circles around the Rakatan fighters. This comparison seems like it's just overkill in the Republic's favor. However, we have a single issue that we need to present: the Starforge. The Starforge is a super weapon that drew upon the dark side of the Force and the power of a star in order to endlessly churn out ships and weapons for the Infinite Empire. A Rakatan fleet may just get swatted like flies during the first engagements with the Republic. However, the Starforge requires no material and never needs rest. The Rakata can continuously produce starships to replace the ones that are lost from the Republic fighting. If they can't overpower the Republic's fleet, they could at least wear them down with endless replacements. This would begin a war of attrition, as the Rakata would send a ceaseless stream of warships into battle, replenishing all lost reinforcements within mere hours. It's not the most efficient method of victory, but if material comes at no cost, then there's no reason for them not to do this. The Republic has already had to deal with the Starforge once before, when Revan and Malak reawakened it. The Jedi had no hope of overcoming the Sith until they destroyed this superweapon. But before we get deeper into it, let's first discuss ground forces, because this is where the battle gets really interesting. The Jedi would be facing down an army of cannibalistic darkside wielders. The Rakata used bestial flesh raiders as their primary foot soldiers. The flesh raiders were a devolved subspecies of the Rakata that were nothing but brute muscle. Although they seemed blundering and crude, they could prove themselves to be difficult opponents to the Jedi of the ancient galaxy. They were even threats to more modern Jedi. In the era of the Old Republic, flesh raiders infested the world of Tython. When the Jedi Order returned to their ancestral homeworld, they had to deal with the savage tribe of flesh raiders there. These ogres killed many Jedi Knights, and made traversing Tython a dangerous endeavor. Leading the flesh raiders were the Force Hounds. These slaves were raised knowing nothing but pain and battle. Failure meant being eaten, so they lived and breathed combat every waking hour. They served the Rakatan Predors, and their main function was to locate Force-rich worlds for the Rakata to subjugate. But they were also the personal bodyguards and assassins of these overlords. The greatest of the Force Hounds was Zesh, a Darksider capable of going toe-to-toe with several Jedi Rangers at once. In the ancient era, a Ranger was equivalent to a Jedi Knight. All of these beings wielded Force sabers by default. These were the archaic ancestors to the more modern lightsaber. The weapon boiled down is little else than alloy cylinders with kyber crystals inside. With no ignition switch, one had to focus the dark side of the Force into the weapon in order for it to ignite. All in the Infinite Empire, from slaves to Predors, utilized the Force saber, though they had several to choose from. Some used a standard single blade, while others chose to use Force saber spears and pikes. Beating Flesh Raiders and Force Hounds in open combat will certainly give Clone Wars Jedi a run for their credits. More than a few Padawans and Knights are going to fall, but we don't think that it would be an overwhelming issue. First things first, the Flesh Raiders were brutes and used Force sabers like clubs. They had none of the finesse that the Clone Wars Jedi would be capable of wielding with their sabers. Not to mention, not every Force Hound was capable of Zesh's skill. He was the best of them, but could not overcome a Jedi Master alone. Most Jedi Knights would likely be able to defeat most Force Hounds in single combat, but that's assuming the Jedi even need to engage them half of the time. One thing we're overlooking is that the Infinite Empire did not use blasters. At least they're not shown using blaster technology in the Dawn of the Jedi. This means they are woefully vulnerable to clones. The Grand Army of the Republic would just be able to melt a Rakatan ground force in an act similar to Order 66. The Rakata Empire did have artillery in the form of small battlefield walkers, which had 3 laser turrets on them, similar to the Octupara Tri-Droids, but they were able to be destroyed by Jedi Hunter-class Starfighters, which means that they don't stand a chance against the Republic ATTE walkers, their ground cannons, their Juggernaut tanks, or any of the other variants of overpowered artillery that the Republic possesses. And of course, we've seen the way Jedi deal with those walkers. So far, the Infinite Empire is failing on every possible front. But what about the Predors? If a battle between the Jedi Masters and the Rakatan Overlords were to happen, could the leaders of the Infinite Empire hold their ground against the Jedi Knights? The Predors are the top of the food chain, the masters of the dark side of their era. They utilize force sabers, but preferred largely to wield their powers in the Force in order to dismantle their enemies. Predor Tulkar and Predor Skalnas both showed the ability to ragdoll Force hounds to execute individuals with a single burst of Force lightning. However, the problem with the Predors is that they never actually studied the Force in any meaningful way. They trained themselves to use it the same way a soldier trains with a weapon. They did not respect the mysticism of their power, but parasitically consumed it like they did everything else. They were not like the Sith, not even close. In fact, Zesh in a blood rage was able to quickly defeat Predor Skalnas in a duel. As clouded as the Jedi in the Clone Wars were, they were still highly capable warriors. We give them a lot of crap for their arrogance and being limited by the veil of the dark side, but they are still incredibly powerful, formidable fighters. A lot of them are only outmatched because they're facing the likes of Dooku and General Grievous. But the Predors do not stand a chance. If one of them were to meet someone like Anakin Skywalker in the open field, he would probably only have as much difficulty with them as he would a Magna Guard. And speaking of Anakin, that's the X factor in all of this. We stated earlier that the one really problematic challenge in this scenario for the Republic is the Starforge. But given how these sorts of situations usually go, it would only be like a week before Anakin, Ahsoka, and Obi-Wan Kenobi would locate the superweapon, and with the trifecta aboard the Starforge, that's a wrap for the Rakata. Call it skill, luck, or plot armor if you would like, but there's no denying that once those three find the nucleus of the Infinite Empire's operation, it's over. So if the Rakata were to return, could the Republic survive? The answer is pretty obvious. In fact, the question should be, how long did the Rakata reasonably have before they're launched back into prehistory? Based on their level of technology and power in the Force, they'd be more like a villain of the week during the long saga of the Clone Wars. But what do you think? Were we too hard on the Infinite Empire? Do you think they have a much better chance than we gave them? Comment if you like these sorts of hypothetical explorations and would like to see more of them. And as always, thank you so much for joining us today in the archives, and may the Force be with you.